All right, welcome to Live, Lead, and In Between, a podcast for leaders who want to be better at leading in life and everywhere in between. My name is Travis Jones, and I'm the host for this podcast. And today's episode, is episode 62, and it's one that I teased a little bit on Patreon in saying that it had been rattling around in my brain for a little bit, and it's probably I can't talk today. Probably been rattling around in there because I've had some instances where I've had to purposely not do the thing we're going to talk about today, both internally and externally. And so today's topic is called Avoidance is not a strategy. Avoidance is not a strategy. So here's the thing. This has to deal with personal conflict. This also has to deal with conflict on a corporate basis. It has to deal with conflict within yourself, things you need to deal with, things like that. So the title is Avoidance is not a strategy. Now, some folks, they do not do well with conflict. And I understand that. I get it. I used to be one of those folks. I used to avoid conflict and let things fester and things like that. And I remember, I think it was in high school where that shifted for me a little bit. And then it's still, as an adult, I didn't do well with it until I had some empowerment come from that. But so some folks don't do well with it. And, my heart goes out to those folks. I like to think that I handle it pretty well now. The team that I oversee now would probably even say that I poke the bear a bit and thrive in awkward situations. And sometimes when I poke the bear, conflict comes out. And I just want to say it's not that I enjoy conflict, because I don't, but I think I've given it enough thought where I understand myself well enough to know that I enjoy the interaction and the navigation of the conflict rather than just the conflict for conflict's sake. I enjoy coming to a solution, working and trying to do that kind of thing. So, but I understand how people don't like conflict and how they will avoid it at all costs. But today I want to talk about that avoidance and what that avoidance actually does. If you use that as your strategy for dealing with conflict, because the number one thing avoidance does is it leaves the conflict unresolved, completely unresolved. And unresolved conflict can cause tons of problems. And I want to talk about that in terms of what avoidance turns conflict into. So the first thing that avoidance will turn conflict into, conflict usually arises out of some type of offense, right? It usually comes up because I didn't like this, or I felt offended, or I felt disrespected, however you want to approach it. Some type of offense is present. Avoiding that conflict, avoiding just stepping into the conflict and trying to bring resolution, if you avoid that, it turns that initial offense that you have into resentment. And resentment is not good. Resentment is like the worst in the world, because what resentment actually does is it slowly begins to fester because you've been avoiding it, and it actually does a couple things in accordance and in kind of being joined in with avoidance. So one of those things is it actually, when you avoid conflict and that resentment breeds, it actually makes the problem, the initial offense, the problem, whatever it was that caused the conflict, it makes that thing seem different from what it actually is. Now, let me put some meat around that a little bit. Initially, when you have a conflict, when there's a problem or an offense, there's a particular thing. Now, you may not really know what that thing is, but it's there. Like you got bumped or something, you have a wound somewhere, something like that. And there's a bump there, and you know that it feels just enough like what was already there to cause that thing to well up in you. And again, you may not 100% know what it is, and you have to do some searching to figure that out. But avoiding a problem, avoiding the conflict, and avoiding working towards a resolution and resentment actually will cause that thing, the reality of that thing, to be completely different. It will mask that thing as something else entirely. So when you avoid the problem, it actually seems different and makes the thing seem different from what it actually is. You can see this thing work itself out in marriages, right? There's a conflict in marriage, and you avoid because you don't want to step on each other's toes. You don't want conflict, for whatever reason. And over time, whatever the problem is actually becomes bigger than what it actually was to begin with. Things get piled on top of it and coated around it and things like that really have nothing to do with the actual thing. And because you avoided it, there's some resentment in there too, and resentment is sticky. Resentment causes things to stick to it. So avoidance does that. Avoidance also, when you avoid that kind of stuff, avoidance also clouds your vision. And when it clouds your vision, and we could go off into a leadership tangent about, having a particular vision and what makes a good vision, but it clouds your vision with that, but it also keeps you from seeing things and people clearly, especially those you are in conflict with, even if they don't know that you're in conflict with them. So it clouds your vision and keeps you from seeing them clearly. Now, on top of that, there's a ton of things that avoidance does, and I'm just going to keep rattling through it. When you avoid handling the conflict and seeking resolution, it makes you handle other situations poorly, especially with those you are in conflict with. It makes you handle things poorly because you're handling them out of a fear, because avoidance is a foot soldier of fear. Okay. I fear this, so I'm going to avoid it. Right. So it actually causes you to handle situations poorly. I remember the church I served at previously, the senior pastor and I had some conflict, and for whatever reason it was there, and I would avoid the conflict because I was afraid of what might come if we engaged in the conflict, because I didn't feel like I didn't feel like personally I would be able to engage in the conflict in a healthy way, so I avoided it that way. Again, not an excuse, because avoidance is not a strategy, but it caused me to handle other situations with the senior pastor poorly. It did. And luckily there was enough grace in that situation to where he, I guess, knew what was going on, and he kept me around for that. But so avoidance makes you handle other situations poorly. Avoidance also, when you avoid and you get resentment, sticky, and that thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it can actually hurt you physically. Over time, it can cause problems with you physically. There are all manner of instances when you get into the world of inner healing and deliverance and freedom where unforgiveness and avoidance of that thing you need to forgive and resentment can cause actual physical problems with your body. And there's a whole spiritual side of that. And I was going to say we won't go into that here, but just know that all of this has a spiritual component because the spirit world operates all around us all the time. But avoidance actually can lead to there being physical problems with yourself. So one of the funniest things, I went through a session with someone, and there was something that I had been avoiding, and when I handled it in that session, I literally felt weight lift off my shoulders. And as you know, shoulders are where figuratively things sit, right? And I felt that leave, and ever since that moment, I have felt lighter, and there's been some physical changes with me. So avoidance can hurt you physically when you avoid conflict with people. Now, you can also engage with conflict with people and get hurt physically, but we're not talking about that. And then the kind of one of the last things I want to talk about with what avoidance does. You've heard the statement, they don't let grass grow under their feet, right? That means they're moving. They're always headed in a particular direction. Well, what avoidance does, avoidance of conflict, avoidance of handling things or seeking resolution, avoidance is letting grass grow under your feet. And the thing about that is, when you're avoiding something, you're not moving. You're not progressing. You're avoiding, you're standing still. So when I say grass grow under your feet, it's actually killing what's growing. It's killing the grass under your feet, figuratively. It doesn't allow for growth. So avoidance is letting the grass grow under your feet, which isn't growing under your feet. It's dying. Okay. So avoidance does all of those things. When you avoid a problem, a conflict, specifically conflict, and you don't seek resolution with all those things, it does all of those things. Now, why do we avoid dealing with personal conflict? Why do we avoid problems? Why do we avoid things? Well, as I thought about this, and it's certainly true for me, and I figure it's probably true for you listening and watching out there, one of the number one reasons that I would avoid things is because of perceived threat. I call it the what if syndrome, right? It's a speculation. It's something that I've painted in my mind. And remember, avoidance usually turns a problem into something different than what it was. I begin to play the what if game. Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? Well, what if this is, and all I'm doing is making this thing that needs to be dealt with bigger than it actually is. I'm wrapping it in deception and speculation. And so it's the what if syndrome, the perceived threat. What happens when I engage in this battle that's about to take place to seek resolution? So we avoid because of what if? What if this happens? What if this happens? I'm arguing with my wife. If I say what I really am feeling right now, what if she threatens to leave me, right? If I'm arguing with a coworker and I say disrespectfully things, that's not work. That's not how you work that. But if I really speak the truth and I do it in love, what if they don't receive it well. And now I've got conflict on my team. It just goes on and on. Internally, what if I forgive someone, right? What if I forgive them? Well, they deserve to deal with the same pain that I've dealt with. So I don't want to forgive them because I want to make sure that they have that same feeling that I have, right? If I don't do that, then my goodness, they're going to wind up not having any consequences for their actions. So the what if syndrome is probably the biggest reason why we avoid conflict, why we avoid resolution, why we avoid those things. The second reason is because it's hard. Honestly, it's hard. It is super hard. Conflict is not easy. It's not. If it was easy, it would be called something else, okay? But conflict is hard. It's hard because it involves you. It involves another person. It involves the baggage that you bring to the situation. It involves their baggage. It involves their perception of you, your perception of them. It involves hurt feelings from a person that you, on the other end, like you may say something to hurt their feelings, which wasn't intended that way, but they turn around because they have a wound that had nothing to do with you, perceive it that way. So it's hard to navigate. And all I would say about that is if you're choosing avoidance, all those other things go along with it. But if you choose to engage with it, you have to check your baggage at the door with that. And you have to pursue resolution to conflict a little dispassionately, because passion is good, but passion misplaced causes damage. Okay? So that's why we don't deal with personal conflict well. That's why we avoid it. Those two things are like the biggest two things I could think of, even in my own life with that. So, but I want to go over how you do engage with it again, because I don't enjoy conflict, but I enjoy the process of working things out and making sure things are worked out. So, one of the things that I'm a processor. So if something happens, I need to process it, because if I don't, and not everybody's like that. My wife is very quick. She processes like she's got one of the new Apple chips, like real fast, right? I've got one of the old Pentium, things that are running. So I have to process things. And so for me, once I have processed what's going on, the first thing I think is, how do I tackle this head on? How do I tackle this head on in a way that is filled with both grace and full of tenacity? Okay. Now notice, passion is a part of that, but tenacity is, I'm going to go after it. So how do I tackle this with grace? Number one. And how do I tackle this with tenacity so that I don't let the grass grow under my feet? So I don't let those things, so I don't wind up avoiding it, right? The danger with somebody like me, that as a processor, is if I process for too long, I wind up stepping over into avoidance. So I have to put a limit on how much I can process and kind of trust my gut, because if I'm dealing with conflict with someone, they'll tell me if they believe I'm wrong, and I'll be able to process that in the moment. So, tenacity. Let's go back to that. Why we got grace. Grace makes sense, right? But why go after something with tenacity? Well, tenacity conveys buy-in, right? It conveys buy-in. I am committed to making sure that this is no longer a thing, so I'm going to tenaciously go after that. And again, grace, it's an obvious thing, but grace, because you're not perfect, and neither is the person that you're in conflict with. It's just not. You can't hold someone accountable to an ideal that you yourself cannot possibly meet. So that's why grace is there. So tenacity for the buy-in, I want to make sure there's resolution, and grace because I'm not perfect, you're not perfect. So we're going to be not perfect at the same time, and we're going to work this out. So I approach it that way. How do I tackle it head on? What's the best way to do that? I think through that. And then in personal conflict, the thing you have to remember in any type of conflict actually is that you are not communicating to change someone's mind. One of the biggest mistakes I see in personal conflict is, and in conflict in general, is typically a person will communicate something trying to change the other person's mind. Not to just say, look at my perspective or look at it from my perspective. I'm not asking you to think differently per se yet, but I'm asking you to look at it from my perspective. And I'm willing to see it from your perspective too, and then we can kind of work through that a little bit. So in conflict, you're not communicating to change someone's mind. You're literally communicating to be heard, and that same should be true for the other person in that conflict. One of the last things in how to do it that I kind of practice is I don't avoid touchy subjects related to the reason for the conflict. Again, if you avoid it for a long time, resentment's sticky and it kind of puts other things around it. So you have to begin to unwrap that to get to the core thing. But I don't avoid the things that may be stuck to the resentment in there. I don't avoid them because the only way there's going to be a resolution is through exposure. And things have to be brought to light to be seen clearly by both people, both parties. Now, all that said, when you're dealing with conflict and you haven't avoided it, sometimes things will end well. They will. They'll end well. I've had instances where things ended well and both parties had a perspective. I've had instances where I've been sitting there and there's been two parties and I've been kind of the person that's kind of helping them navigate it because they need somebody else. But sometimes they end well. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes people fake they end well and then they need to process, and that's fine. They can process. Other times people pretend that things are ending well and they never have really resolved it. They just want out of the situation. So here's the thing, when they do end well, even if somebody's faking it, you celebrate that, right? Celebrate the fact that there's resolution or even perceived resolution to the conflict in that moment. Celebrate it. If in a conflict, personal, interpersonal, internal, all this stuff, and even in a work conflict, if you're in a position that conflict happens and it does not end well, I've had one of those recently, it didn't end well, you mourn that. It's okay to mourn the fact that the conflict did not end well. And then give equal space for both. You let it breathe. You let it breathe and let it breathe with some boundaries. And when I say let it breathe, that's going to sound like, okay, I'm going to avoid it. No, you're letting the situation breathe so that if the person needs to process and you need to process, you're letting that happen. But if you're one of the initiators for the resolution for this, then you've got to come back and say, I want to come back around and I'm going to talk about this again just to see where we're at, right? And if it still doesn't end well, again, there are scriptural ways to handle conflict, and we practice those where I serve at the church, Matthew 18. But you do that respectfully above all else with that. So, and again, just to tell a quick story, I've had an instance where I had a conflict early on, and I don't want to give too many details about this because I'm sure that it has been brought to resolution, but the parties involved need to. It doesn't need to be out there like that. So I'm going to give you some example or an example. Then I'm going to change the names to protect the innocent. I may not even say the names, but I had my own baggage coming into something, and through that own baggage that I had experienced, it caused a problem in a relationship that I had. And I'll just say it caused a problem in mine and my wife's relationship because baggage that I brought into it. It was baggage based off something else that had nothing to do with her, and it had nothing to do with the other people, but it caused me not to actually move in a way that would correct the other people when they stepped on a boundary that should have been in place. And when that didn't happen, I had to process through it, and I had to go back around to actually handle that. And then there were tears on both sides of things, but I had to be the one to say, listen, because of my baggage with this, I did not handle this appropriately, and I should have. And what happened with this was inappropriate. And I'm not interested in dismantling our relationship with that. I am interested in you hearing my perspective on that, but just know that this is a boundary that I have with my family, and we can't cross it. We can't cross it because when we cross it, we're going to have problems, and those problems I'm going to meet head on with tenacity and grace. Just know. And so we worked through those things, and it ended okay. And so I wouldn't say it ended great, right? What I will say is at the end of trying to resolve it, there were hugs exchanged. So it didn't end super poorly, but it still kind of felt like, And so I let it breathe. I let it breathe for a while, and I let the whole situation just kind of settle. I processed it a little more. They processed it a little more. Processed it with my wife some. And then I turned around and actually, a little bit of time later, went and talked to them again. They had processed it. They saw my point of view on it. They even apologized. Didn't ask for the apology. They apologized. So, again, there's a way of working that out. Now, the reason I had baggage prior to that I brought into it was because there was a similar circumstance that had happened, and the baggage, I avoided it. I avoided it for a long time, and then I moved to handle it, and it went badly. And there's a whole host of reasons why it went badly, why there was a problem to begin with, but it caused a schism in the relationship for like 6 or 7 months where I didn't talk to the other people, which isn't good for relationships, obviously, right? And so I had that baggage coming in. So just an example of that thing working itself out. I've had other examples in situations where you're talking with people, and you have oversight over them, and you've seen something in them that you need to bring out, and they don't want to hear it, right? And you have to walk that way. You have to do it with tenacity and grace in that. And I've sat across from people and been the recipient of someone that had an issue with me bringing it to my attention. And it was hard. It was super, super hard. And I won't go into too many details about that. But just know, avoidance is not a strategy in any way, shape, or form. Because when we move to avoid, we're putting a vote in the box of resentment. And resentment and unforgiveness are sticky, and they turn bigger than they actually are, and you wind up paying the price for that in that avoidance. Things need to be brought to the light for resolution. So I'll stop there with that. I think I've went a little longer than I've needed to with this, but avoidance isn't a strategy. So if you're a leader and you're avoiding conflict within your team, you're avoiding conflict within your marriage, you avoid conflict in general, I would tell you to go and devote some prayer and ask God why you're avoiding those things. And then once he answers that and you begin to resolve that within yourself, don't avoid him anymore. Go after him. Go after him with tenacity, grace, because those things need to be resolved for you to move forward. So I'll stop there with that. If you found this helpful, if you've enjoyed this podcast, or you like any of them we're doing, I would encourage you, if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button. That helps us get out there. Share it with somebody. If you're watching on Spotify, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, I really appreciate you listening. Again, hope this has been helpful. And if it's not, well, you got other stuff you can watch, right? So this has been Live, Lead, and In Between. And I would encourage you to lead well in every single thing you do. And don't avoid problems. Don't avoid conflict. Go after it.